Hello to everyone who's joining us from session 2 and those who are joining just now. Thank you for joining us today for session 3 of the Making African America, Immigration and the Changing Dynamics of Blackness virtual symposium. I am the chair of this session. My name is Quincy Mills, and I am Associate Professor of History at the University of Maryland. This session is titled Struggles for Civil and Labor Rights. Struggles for justice have shaped the relationship of Black migrants and African Americans for generations. This panel considers the contributions of Black diasporic organizers and activists in the long history of civil rights and labor rights. Our esteemed panelists, I will introduce them all right now. Glenn Chambers Jr. is Associate Professor of History at Michigan State University and author of Race, Nation, and West Indian Immigration to Honduras, 1890 to 1940. His current project highlights West Indian migration to highly racialized Jim Crow New Orleans. Central to Chambers' scholarship is an emphasis on the ways in which people of African descent have maintained a common identity rooted in a shared history and experience. Our next panelist is Kaysha Corinealdi, who's Assistant Professor of History at Emerson College and a Fellow at the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at Harvard University. She's completing revisions on her manuscript titled Defining Panama, Zones of Exclusion and Afro-Caribbean Diasporic World Making. Her work has been supported by the Woodrow Wilson National Foundation and featured in the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies and the Global South. Our third panelist is Fumilayo Showers, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at the University of Connecticut. Her current book project, Immigrants Who Care, West Africans in the U.S. Long-Term Care Industry, chronicles the expressions of African immigrants as direct care workers in the U.S. healthcare industry. Showers' research interests include U.S. immigration, labor migration and entrepreneurship, and race, class, and gender inequality in healthcare. So first we will have Dr. Chambers present his work.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all for coming to the panel, and I appreciate the opportunity always to speak about my work. I know everyone was looking forward to a conference in person, but times required the virtual format, and so here we are. The idea for this paper stems from previous research conducted while I was working on my latest book, From the Banana Zones to the Big Easy, that came out in 2019 with Louisiana State University Press. The book looks at West Indian and Central American immigration to New Orleans between 1910 and 1940, and the ways in which this population navigated race in the Jim Crow South. Themes of immigration, labor, because most of the Black immigrants were merchant seamen, residential patterns, cultural retention, and family surfaced throughout the work. Americanization for so many Black immigrants meant the indoctrination and assimilation into a racist system that devalued Black life. To be quote unquote American was to be in effect second class and absorbed into the larger African American community. In order to tell this story, countless hours were spent analyzing fruit company papers, immigration and naturalization papers, Union archives, New Orleans City records, and any other relevant documents that would allow me to get a sense of who was coming to New Orleans and how their lives were shaped by the racial dynamics of the city. In one of my many archival trips, I was looking through US immigration records and noticed an application for citizenship filed in Los Angeles by a Panama native, Eric Allen Dolphy Sr. As an avid jazz fan and one-time aspiring musician, I immediately noticed the name as that of the father of one of my all-time favorite musicians, Eric Dolphy Jr., whose music I first encountered as an undergraduate bass student on many Charles Mingus and Chico Hamilton records of the late 1950s and early 1960s. What attracted me to Dolphy's music was his ability to push musical boundaries and challenge the conventions of Western music. It was as if Dolphy was always searching for something. He didn't always accomplish it musically, but it was almost as if he took pleasure in the journey. Once discovering the immigrant roots of Eric Dolphy, I set out to determine what role this may have played in Dolphy's musical journey. Also, Dolphy's story allows us, I think, to move past Indian immigrants as simply workers for banana companies or railroad and construction projects and learn how they live. Better yet, how their dreams and aspirations were realized through their children. To accomplish this with Dolphy, I had to start with the music. And so I'll say that, I've written extensively about banana companies and railroad companies and how West Indian labor was used and sort of the obstacles that they faced in those dynamics. And so with this project, I'm taking a slight turn in which labor is still involved. The activism is still there. However, it's done more through an artistic framework than sort of the traditional ways that we think about it. And so in late 1960 or early 1961, Eric Dolphy recorded a session with the Latin Jazz Quintet in New York City. The album, released as Eric Dolphy and the Latin Jazz Quintet, consisted largely of quote unquote Latin interpretations of jazz standards and a few originals by Felipe Diaz, the group's leader. Subsequent liner notes from a 1994 reissue of the album noted that the recording date was the second of only two incursions by Dolphy into the musical genre known as Latin jazz. However, the writer of the liner notes remarked that there were a few isolated examples from Dolphy's growing discography of songs that music critics noted as having a certain Latin flavor to them. Despite their Latin influence, none of these recordings were seen as clearly within the Latin jazz genre. To critics, Eric Dolphy was new to Latin music, and this musical foray was only a small footnote to a career marked by testing the limits of modern jazz, but deeply rooted within it and the African American tradition from which it originated. Scholarly interpretations of Dolphy's work maintain that he was known for refusing to succumb to the limitations of his instruments, alto saxophone, flute, and bass clarinet, respectively, and for calling theme into question by revalorizing an improvisation style that incorporated a highly dissonant, sprightly sound that was impacted more by a stream of consciousness playing than predetermined harmonic and melodic cliches. It owed as much to the early tradition of New Orleans jazz improvisation styles as it did to the bebop music of his generation. As quote unquote out as Dolphy played in his solos, Dolphy was always in or within the melodic and harmonic structure of a given tune. He never broke the rules of Western musical conventions. However, he pushed these conventions and his instruments to their limits. In many instances, Eric Dolphy's approach to music mirrored his life. His incursions into Latin music was not coincidental. What the critics and music journalists of the period and many jazz aficionados at the time did not realize was that Dolphy was a first-generation American whose parents, often described simply as Caribbean or West Indian, were actually Panamanian and Costa Rican, respectively, though both of British West Indian heritage. They were both bilingual, English and Spanish speaking, and settled in Los Angeles, a city with a sizable Spanish-speaking Mexican population that Dolphy remembered quite fondly. Therefore, Dolphy's incursion into Latin music were not based on simple musical curiosity or bandwagon jumping, but rather were an extension of his identity as the only child of immigrants whose roots included Jamaica, but were nurtured in the banana zones and canal zone of Central America and later cemented in Los Angeles. So in this paper, I maintained that Dolphy's approach to jazz and his incorporation of Latin and Caribbean themes into his solos, his international relationships with Latin American and European classical musicians, and his subsequent migration to Europe were representative of a much larger negotiation that Caribbean and Latin American immigrants made during the period when confronted with an American system of race. For Dolphy, this was compounded by the fact that he was unambiguously of African descent and grew up as an African American whose families had grew up with African Americans whose family had migrated from the South to Los Angeles during the Great Migration. Also keep in mind that Dolphy's father had also made the migration from Louisiana to Los Angeles, like countless other Black Americans from the state. For many immigrant Blacks, the inability to quote unquote fit culturally within the Black-white racial binary that often extended into representations of pop culture created a situation in which many were free to explore the depths of the music without the need to adhere to conventions. While Dolphy was never burdened by the racial binary because his family quickly assimilated into African American Los Angeles, his explorations were often viewed by critics, both fellow jazz artists and professional critics, as eccentric without understanding their origins. For Dolphy, his explorations were rooted firmly in the African American experiences of Black Los Angeles, but augmented by the Caribbean and Central American roots of his parents and his exposure to Mexican and other immigrant experiences. For Dolphy, it was possible to embody all of these things musically, if not physically. Music allowed for exploration in ways that life did not. In her assessment of Arturo Schomburg, the famed bibliophile, archivist, and historian of the African diaspora during the first half of the 20th century, Vanessa Valdez notes that Afro-Latinos have to contend with racialized systems that are of their own countries, but also simultaneously those of the United States. To put it another way, Afro-Latinos, particularly in the United States, must perform both Blackness and Latinness in such a way that is satisfactory to those within the larger Latino community, but also acceptable to those outside it, which is often an insurmountable feat. Whereas Schomburg was able to find acceptance and ease of living in already existing Afro-diasporic spaces, I maintain that Dolphy was able to find the same sense of freedom in jazz music and its ability to embrace and absorb influences from throughout the African diaspora and beyond. In fact, it actually may have been easier for Dolphy because, unlike Schomburg, Dolphy grew up in a Los Angeles in which there was not a significant foreign-born Black population of any nationality. Dolphy was not the only jazz musician of West Indian and or Latin American heritage. The history of modern jazz is filled with many notable musicians of Caribbean descent, some more well-known than others. From famed artists such as Fats Navarro, Machito, Wynton Kelly, Sonny Rollins, Clifford Brown, Art Taylor, to lesser heralded artists such as Carmen McRae, Elmo Hope, and Blue Mitchell, and others, the number of musicians from the Caribbean or with Caribbean roots is significant. Most of their families arrived in the United States during the period between the turn of the 20th century and the exclusionary policies of the 1924 immigration laws. Caribbean immigrants and their descendants resided within intersecting boundaries of race and ethnicity in which they negotiated multiple identities. So I just want to mention a little bit of background about Dolphy. His father immigrated from Las Cascadas and Con in the Panama Canal Zone to the United States at the age of 20 through New Orleans, where he would have been in contact with early jazz and its influences before settling in Los Angeles shortly thereafter. There was a long history of the United Fruit Company and Canal Zone employers bringing in New Orleans musicians to entertain workers and their families throughout the period. Dolphy's mother, Sedexter Clemencia Dolphy, was born in Guasimo, Costa Rica in Limon province and immigrated to the United States from Panama through New York City in 1923. Going back even further, Sadie's mother, Maud Gilling, or Dolphy's grandmother, who lived with her daughter and son-in-law in Los Angeles for a time when Eric Jr. was a toddler, was Panamanian, as were her parents, indicating that through the Gillings, Dolphy's roots in Panama dated back to at least the mid-19th century, before the massive influx of West Indians to help with the railroad and canal projects. And based on census data from the Panama Canal Zone conducted by the US government in 1920, Eric's parents were listed, Eric Sr.'s parents, or Dolphy's grandparents, were listed as Native Jamaicans on his father's side. The Dolphys lived in the Exposition Park area of South Los Angeles in a community that was increasingly African American, the result of the Second Great Migration West, in which African Americans from the South moved beginning in the 1930s in search of better opportunities. Dolphy Sr. worked as a mechanic, and Sadie was a housewife who was very active in her community and in the local church. Dolphy went to high school with notable jazz pianist Hampton Hawes and worked extensively with composer Charles Mingus, whose families were also migrants to the area. In fact, it was with Mingus that Dolphy left for Europe in 1964, a trip that would ultimately prove fatal for Dolphy, as he died in November of that year from a diabetic coma. In an assessment of fellow Angelino and famed saxophonist Dexter Gordon, his biographer and widow, Maxine Gordon, noted that the music that young jazz musicians created in the mid-20th century was the product of years of working together in close community, studying together, eating together, laughing together, and playing together. As with most things, some musicians took their craft more seriously than others. Eric Dolphy had the reputation of being the most serious of musicians. At Dorsey High School in Los Angeles, Dolphy served as the student director of the orchestra. He also gained valuable experience on the LA jazz scene, learning from Lloyd Reese, who was also mentored by Bill Douglas, Dexter Gordon, Jackie Kelso, Buddy Collette, and other notable musicians from the era. He also worked with Gerald Wilson, another mentor to jazz musicians on the West Coast. In all accounts of Dolphy from the period, he is described as an avid practicer. Notable bassist Larry Ridley, who lived for a time in an apartment building near Dolphy in New York City in the early 1960s, noted that while some musicians were addicted to various vices, Dolphy was addicted to his horn. He was addicted to practice. It's actually through Dolphy's practice regimen that one is able to discern much about his immigrant background. His musical notebooks that are available at the Library of Congress and other notes just show the deep level of commitment to Dolphy's that Dolphy had towards his work, whether it's translating text into from Spanish into English, or writing notations in various forms of in different keys, just really getting into the tune, learning all aspects of the tunes and tracing the history of the tune. Again, Dolphy was an extensive practicer. And so I'll just, in closing, Dolphy, like other West Indians of his era, did not shy away from a Black identity. West Indians, in general, married into African-American families, were active in African-American cultural institutions, and fought alongside African-Americans for an end to racial discrimination through civil rights and Pan-African organizations. However, in addition to laboring with African-Americans, they also created with African-Americans and fought for the right to express themselves freely. As mentioned previously, Dolphy gained notoriety in the jazz world, first with Chico Hamilton and most notably with Mingus. Mingus often referred to Dolphy as his muse and wrote several pieces with Dolphy, with Dolphy's high level of musicianship in mind. Dolphy's latter association with John Coltrane in the early 1960s is credited with broadening the musical landscape for Coltrane, influencing some of Coltrane's most creative compositions during the period. It was Dolphy's work ethic and depth of musical knowledge that Coltrane admired. Ornette Coleman also mentions the influence of Dolphy. And while Dolphy's musical associations represent a who's who of art bop and avant-garde artists, surprisingly absent in the story of Eric Dolphy are overt references to his immigrant past, which undoubtedly shaped his musical trajectory. Through the process of protesting musically and inspiring others to do the same, Dolphy left a lasting impact on jazz. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very wonderful take on Dolphy. Certainly would look forward to hearing more. Next, we'll pass the mic to Professor Corinealdi.
Thank you, and my thanks to everyone involved at the University of Maryland, College Park, and at the National Museum of African American History for putting this conference together. For my presentation, I'm going to focus on the role of Afro-Panamanians and activist histories in Black Brooklyn. To this day, one of the largest population of Afro-Panamanians in the United States resides in Brooklyn, New York. My forthcoming book, Defining Panama, historicizes this phenomenon by looking at the lives of Black Panamanians, most with ancestry from the Anglophone Caribbean, who made Brooklyn home starting in the late 1940s and into the 1960s. In particular, I examined the lives of the creators and members of Las Cervidoras, a scholarship-granting civic association created by Afro-Panamanian women in 1950s Brooklyn. With my brief presentation today, I will map out the factors that made Brooklyn especially appealing to Black Panamanians and give examples of the specific work undertaken by Las Servidoras to build a hemispheric network of Black solidarity that connected Brooklyn to Panama and Panama to Brooklyn during the Civil Rights era. In conducting research on Las Servidoras, I found that most of the creators had migrated to New York in the late 1940s or early to mid 1950s, and that they often relied on extended family who had made the journey sometimes as early as the mid 19-teens, following the completion of the Panama Canal. And Dr. Chambers noted some of that migration, so it was great to have him present prior to me. In time, I also observed that the creators and most of the eventual members of Las Servidoras from the 1950s and into the 1960s made Brooklyn, New York, their permanent residence. So this made me ask, what about Brooklyn made it such a communal spot for the women of Las Servidoras and for other Black Panamanians? One answer responded to the growth of Brooklyn as a Black urban center of the 1940s. Southern Blacks, immigrant Blacks, and Blacks born in New York form part of this urban base. The completion of subway lines connecting central Brooklyn to Manhattan in the late 1930s also facilitated this demographic trend. By 1940, Brooklyn offered cheaper rents and more home ownership opportunities than Harlem or Manhattan as a whole. For the founders and the future members of Las Servidoras, home ownership was especially important. By law, no one in the US controlled Panama Canal Zone, where most of the women who created or joined Las Servidoras had worked, lived, or had some other connection to, could own property, since all land came under the purview of the United States government. Living in the Canal Zone also meant being subject to Jim Crow segregationist policies. Really, Panama is one of the few places where the United States actually enacts Jim Crow policies of discrimination on an entire different set of populations. And this ensured that when Afro-Panamanians, many of whom have Afro-Caribbean backgrounds, enter the United States, they're deeply familiar with segregation, both as it is practiced in the US in a neo-colony, and also as it pertains to anti-Blackness, as it is practiced in Central America. In Panama City and Colón, the two main cities within Panama where most Afro-Panamanians in Brooklyn migrated from, there was also rampant overcrowding, which made the opportunity of home ownership very difficult. And those seeking to become homeowners also had to find a way to finance and build their own homes. Hence, all these factors made wanting to purchase a home particularly important for these migrants. The presence of other Black migrants from throughout the Caribbean also increased the appeal of Brooklyn among Afro-Panamanians. Many of these residents came from the Anglophone Caribbean, especially Barbados and Jamaica, in addition to other places in the Caribbean, such as Puerto Rico and Haiti. By the mid-1940s, Brooklyn also counted on the presence of select Black public officials, as well as a plethora of Black associations, both local and national, that addressed the civic, communal, and legal needs of the borough's Black residents. Black migrants from the Anglophone Caribbean also operated their own associations at this time. It is important to note that rampant segregation did pose a challenge to those seeking to start anew in Brooklyn. By the 1940s, banks, landlords, and insurance companies had mapped out Brooklyn into desirable and undesirable areas. And I'm sure that many of you viewing are familiar with the red line mappings that were created by banks using the colors of green, yellow, and red to demarcate safe and unsafe neighborhoods. And often a high rate of Black and Puerto Rican residents effectively sealed a neighborhood's fate as being labeled as undesirable or hazardous. Notwithstanding these labels of undesirability, people of color continued to make their way to North and Central Brooklyn, two areas that were often deemed undesirable within these mappings, and to neighborhoods like Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights. Some also pushed against these boundaries, and among them were Afro-Panamanians. It is in fact the brownstone in the Clinton Hill area of Brooklyn, one owned by Nesta and Henry Samuel, that would serve as the eventual headquarters of Las Servidoras. Indeed, for Afro-Panamanians, making home in areas deemed undesirable and unprofitable by corporate and municipal authorities, or for those trying to defy the housing color line, a good neighborhood did not require white residents. Instead, a good neighborhood offered a better quality of life and more abundant opportunities than those present in the places of their birth or previous residency. The Afro-Panamanians choosing to reside in Brooklyn in the 1940s and 50s were especially prepared to take advantage of these opportunities. Many had some level of formal education, had worked for years in their places of birth. A number were entrepreneurs, had come with savings in hand, and often sought out a small network of relatives or friends who had migrated before them. Relocating to Brooklyn then was not just about the racial politics of the time, but also about the ways that Afro-Panamanians could change and remake this space. As migrants, they brought the histories of their previous homes while also connecting these to racial and ethnic politics in New York. There were therefore migrants who were familiar with multiple levels of diasporas, as Afro-Caribbeans, then as migrants to the United States, and as migrants who understood national politics as Panamanians and eventually as US citizens, and ultimately as self-defined women and men ready to engage in hemispheric conversations about civil rights. And this takes me to Las Servidoras. So from its establishment in 1953, the founding members of Las Servidoras made the decision to recruit only women, most of whom were Afro-Panamanians, as members. The name Las Servidoras also spoke to a desire within the membership to recapture part of Panama in New York. Within New York, most of the women in the group were likely viewed as Black women with roots in either the United States or the Anglophone Caribbean. By choosing a Spanish title for the organization while conducting their meetings in English, the membership laid claim to a bilingual and multi-diasporic understanding of Panama, of New York, and of Blackness. In this way, they defied nationalist expectations of the time that focused on one language, one nation, and one identity. One of the fundraising ventures used by Las Servidoras to raise scholarship monies included hosting dinner dances or luncheons that both featured or paid tribute to prominent members of the Afro-Panamanian diaspora in New York. These events also hosted guest speakers connected to Black Brooklyn, such as Shirley Chisholm, and the broader Caribbean world. In particular, I will focus on the organization's 10th anniversary celebration in April of 1963, and then a luncheon hosted in 1966. As part of their 10th anniversary celebration, which took place at the St. George's Hotel in Brooklyn, the organization invited longtime educational leader and former teacher and principal in the Canal Zone Colored Schools, Leonard Jump Watson, as their guest speaker. Inviting Jump Watson was quite important because it once more reminded the US public that Jim Crow policies were a reality outside of the United States and in Panama, And it also provided evidence of how Black Panamanians had pushed against the segregation by using schools as a thriving space for community and support. In addition to inviting Jump Watson as a speaker, Las Servidoras also used the occasion of their anniversary to become lifelong members of the NAACP. The event as a whole spoke to the Black diasporic networks that throughout the 20th century connected spaces like Brooklyn to the Panamanian Isthmus. With their first spring luncheon in 1966, Las Servidoras not only distributed honors, but also explicitly engaged with the civil rights discourse of the time. On the invitations created for the luncheon, the group emblazoned the motto, Las Servidoras recognizes education and civil rights as one and the same. In taking this stance, the women of Las Servidoras affirmed that a quality education was a right and not a privilege, and in this way joined with parents and organizers from across New York City, demanding the end to the systemic neglect of students of color within the public school system. Collectively, the anniversary dinner dance, the luncheon, and scholarships raised from these events offered Las Servidoras two unique opportunities: to talk against stereotypes that marginalize communities of color, and to place the unique perspectives of Afro-Panamanians at the center of ongoing New York City civil rights campaign. The work of Las Servidoras continues to this day, albeit in a more reduced way. One of the ongoing legacies of the organization is the impact made by their scholarship recipients. I will end my presentation with a story of one particular awardee. Marsha Baines Smith, a 1967 to 1970 scholarship recipient, who I had an opportunity to interview, credited Las Servidoras for her formation as an activist and scholar. Baines Smith was working in Panama City and attending classes in the Canal Zone Junior College. She spoke of the difficulty of navigating work and school in Panama, her decision to apply for college in the United States, and spoke with relief and pride about her ability to secure a scholarship from Las Servidoras. She also insisted that beyond the money, what she most appreciated from the women of Las Servidoras was their, quote, emotional support and spiritual guidance. After graduating college and attending graduate school, Baines Smith went on to work as a social worker. Many of the adults and families she assisted were migrants of the post-1965 period. As a migrant Black woman and a bilingual Spanish and English speaker, Baines Smith had a particular connection to the people she served. Eventually, her frustration at, quote, implementing policies that were created by people who did not have a clue about the communities they were servicing pushed Baines Smith to both start her own organization targeted at the needs of Caribbean women in New York, the Caribbean Women's Health Association, and to begin a doctoral program in social work. As the experience of Baines Smith makes clear, through their work, Las Servidoras engendered a new generation of leaders. Their determination and that of their scholarship awardees to not only make Brooklyn home, but to expand and remake the contours of this space, enrich Brooklyn as a center of Black life, Black opportunity, and Black brilliance that connected the United States to a broader Black diaspora world. The history and potentials of this world-making, grounded by the thoughts and actions of Black people, is what has animated my work and what I'm excited to have an opportunity to discuss further with you all during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. Education has for a long time been quite critical to how African Americans and as you have shown us, Afro-Panamanians have thought about freedom. And so thank you for that. Professor Showers, you have the mic.
Thank you, Dr. Mills. And I want to thank the organizers for this invitation. It is truly a pleasure and honor to be part of this conference. My goal in this panel is to account for the experiences of contemporary first-generation African immigrants and to talk about this current moment in the long durée of race and migration in the US. Based on my reading of the scholarship on race and African immigration, there are at least two major themes that have been established. One is to note the exponential growth in this immigrant population in recent years. For instance, many studies hail African immigrants as the fastest growing immigrant population. Two is to credit this growth to a series of immigration policies that were set in motion during the activism of the civil rights era, in particular the 1965 Axela Immigration Act, which has been brought up in other panels earlier, opened up immigration pathways to countries and peoples previously excluded. I situate my comments this evening within these established frameworks. In doing so, I want to think of contemporary African immigrants as the heirs of some of the triumphs of the activism of the civil rights era as it pertains to immigration policy. At the same time, they have become incorporated into existing racial structures. They've experienced anti-Black racism in US society and a specific form of racial animus targeted towards Africans that I and others have called African origin discrimination. They are also participants in the long and ongoing struggle for racial justice in America, all the while striving to achieve the so-called American dream. As a sociologist and an ethnographer, I am equipped to elucidate their daily lives, experiences, challenges, and successes. And I can talk about how their struggle plays out within institutional context, specifically in the labor market and the healthcare sector, which is the particular arena in which I have devoted my attention. I draw insights from ethnographic interactions and interviews among West African immigrants, primarily based in the Washington, D.C. metro area. I mentioned earlier the importance of 1965 as a watershed moment in US immigration, as we in this audience all know. Other recent developments in the US immigration regime have also had a tremendous impact on the increase in African immigration and individual trajectories in the labor market. I will briefly here mention two policies. The 1980 Refugee Act, which allowed for refugees or asylum seekers to enter the US, explains the growth in this population and reflects perhaps the periodic crisis in many parts of the continent. Many of my research interlocutors from Sierra Leone and Liberia had entered the US as refugees or sought asylum, as did their counterparts from English-speaking Cameroon. And there are many ethnographies and studies of African refugee populations, such as the Somali Bantu in Maine and Minnesota, Liberians in Staten Island, New York, and so on, and their struggles for recognition, labor rights, as well as their battles against racism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia. Another major pathway to immigration came about as a result of the 1990 immigration law. This law established the diversity visa lottery, which provides permanent residence or green card status to those eligible. DV lottery winners in my research ranged from recent college graduates, unemployed and underemployed, to seasoned professionals who traded their successful and middle-class careers for the opportunity to live and work in the US. Ironically, some in this group entered more well-paying but low-status jobs. Many others just sought a new life and opportunity in America. So far, I've argued that contemporary Africans have been able to enter the US and to carve out new lives due to the generally liberal immigration legislative landscape, well, at least in comparison to the explicitly racially exclusionary past. And of course, there's a lot to discuss about immigration in the recent past and during the Trump era. However, lest we get too carried away on this rosy or optimistic picture, I qualify my comments by saying not every immigrant can access these legal immigration pathways, and many, including some people in my research, find themselves outside of these legal provisions. Thus, as we think through current day struggles and agitation for civil and human rights, we should keep the criminalization of undocumented immigrants, the carceral state, and the current enforced detention and deportation regime in our conversations. I think this is important because I believe Black immigrants have been obscured in the everyday discourses and media coverage of, say, DACA or asylum struggles or the debates around deportation. Now, as much as immigration policies can tell us about who can enter the US and how they're selected to enter, what can immigrants' lived experiences tell us about race, racism, racial identity, and the struggles for civil rights today and into the future? Scholarship on immigration today has taken up this question. In sociology and much of the social sciences, the space between race and ethnicity among Black immigrants has opened up a line of intense debate and inquiry. Questions have been raised such as, do Black immigrants experience their ethnicity as an advantage in US society? Do they distance themselves from African Americans? Do they emphasize their ethnic particularity and cling to immigrant identities and cultures? And is employer preference for Black immigrants a reason for some of this distancing behavior? A lot of foundational studies that attended to these questions focused on English-speaking Caribbean immigrants, and many responded to these questions with a resounding yes. Some of the ensuing analysis posits a Black immigrant experience that is fundamentally different and in some ways diametrically opposed to the African American experience. I take a different tack. I see points of historical continuity and convergence in the experiences of African immigrants and African Americans. I see these points of convergence occurring in two ways. First, continued racialization in US society on the one hand, and the workings of neoliberal capitalism on the other, or as Cedric Robinson and others have theorized, racial capitalism, that position recent African immigrants and other immigrants of color at the bottom of professional hierarchies in the labor market. I also see ongoing racial discrimination in specific workplaces and institutional settings. I will give some brief examples here drawn from my qualitative data to support this reading. I am happy to expand on these points and provide examples in the Q&A. The main way, in my understanding, that Africans have experienced discrimination in the US labor market has to do with the devaluation of the African-earned credentials. And this finding has been documented in other studies of this group. Marilyn Holter and Violet Charles Johnson talked about this in their monograph on West African immigrants. What this means for individual immigrants is that turned away from previous occupations and with degrees from home worthless in the US labor market, they turn to occupational niches that are open to absorbing Black and brown immigrants. Positions at the base of the healthcare field become one such avenue, as I found in my research. I documented the case of folks like the Cameroonian aeronautic engineer who was forced to become a home health aide and later a healthcare recruiter in the US, or the Sierra Leonean lawyer who became a disability support worker, or many nurses and midwives from Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone who were forced to start their careers over as certified nursing assistants at the bottom of all professional and racial hierarchies in healthcare. Now, I should complicate this a little and say that though they started at the bottom of these hierarchies, some achieved professional success and rose to become healthcare professionals like nurses and also entrepreneurs. In my work, I have tried to work out this contradiction. I resist a reductive analysis or framing of this group simply as the exploited masses, and I've tried to account for individual agency, the ways in which people have enacted strategies like work 2 or 3 jobs to pay for further schooling, developed social capital, opened businesses, etc. These are the ideas that I develop in my forthcoming book. Secondly, contrary to the established orthodoxy on race and Caribbean immigration, at least in sociology, I did not find evidence of an ethnic advantage for African immigrants in healthcare. I found that not only did Africans in mainstream healthcare institutions experience racist discrimination, they experienced discrimination as a result of their African identities. Research participants perceived that Africans were at the bottom of professional hierarchies in their workplaces and in specializations that are more labor-intensive, less pleasant, and considered less skilled. Some also believed that their Africanness served as a source of disadvantage in work settings due to stereotypes and popularly held negative views of Africa as a continent. This feeling was expressed by one of my research participants, and I quote, "I found out that in the beginning, being a foreign trained nurse, and with accent too, you meet all kinds of challenges. Patients, some of them will discriminate against who takes care of them, and also people you work with. You might have some patients who will tell you, I can't understand what you're saying. Can you speak English? Can you just go back to Africa? And some will not even tell you, but by their attitude, you know they don't want you to take care of them," unquote. One way in which I make sense of this finding of ethnic disadvantage and racism in healthcare versus what others have found in other sectors of the economy is to argue that institutional context or industry-specific relations and histories matter in the experiences of various groups. Nursing, for instance, has a long history of documented racism. Scholars like Darlene Clark-Hine and Adia Harvey-Wingfield found this among African-American nurses. In nursing, we're talking about a context with close, intimate relations of care. There's a physical and tactile proximity that you don't find in other fields. Many people told me that patients didn't want them to touch them. They didn't want Africans to touch them. There are intergenerational divides in elder care, for instance, where older adults, sometimes suffering from dementia, would act on racial impulses, unfiltered, versus in other settings. I also think that these findings speak to heterogeneity of experience and maybe hints at ethnic diversity, not only obviously between native-born and foreign-born Blacks, but by national, regional origin, differential reception to regional or national groups that we ought to pay attention to moving forward. In conclusion, I have tried to trace paths of progress in African immigration since the civil rights era, but I have also highlighted historical continuity in the native-born and immigrant Black experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Certainly a lot to think about, particularly within the context of neoliberalism and the ways in which Black immigrants have been, as you have pointed out, sort of placed in at the bottom of a labor hierarchy. And so I hope that we get unpeel that a bit more. Our first question from the audience is from JG in the chat, and that's for Professor Corinealdi. I am struck by Dr. Chambers' comment that immigrants have to perform both Latinness and Blackness. Did you also find that in your work on Afro-Panamanians in Brooklyn?
Thank you for that question. That's such a great reminder of the connections, right, that unite a number of the sort of points that have come up in the panel. Specifically connecting to Afro-Panamanians, I found that this sort of balancing of Latinidad and Blackness had an added component in that the Caribbean, right? And this idea of an English, French-speaking Caribbean and understanding added a third layer to all of this. So on the one hand, you had critiques that were being raised in terms of not being included among Latino communities that did not want to engage with the idea of Blackness, or of non-Spanish speaking populations or bilingual populations. And you also had a kind of Caribbean community that also sort of wanted to figure out how to straddle where Afro-Panamanians with this sort of Central American and Caribbean identity belonged. So there was certainly this opportunity to form part of multiple communities, but the challenges in not always being recognized. So for example, a lot of the information that I ended up finding of Las Servidoras outside of my interviews with the founders of the NISAs were things that were published in the Black press. So there was no coverage of the group really in the Spanish language press. And so for me, that was a real clear example that for many of those who were interacting with these women or sort of passing them in the street, they could not see them as forming part of this Latino community because there was simply no space for that. So that for me is sort of an indication of why we need, when we do this kind of research and when we think about community, we need to look beyond kind of one language or even one particular geographic location and really ask questions that connect us across the board.
Thank you. Another question from the audience for Professor Chambers. What does it mean that Dolphy's immigrant past has been largely erased or ignored? What are we missing in our understandings of Blackness and culture here?
Yes, thanks for that question. I don't think it's been totally ignored. I think Dolphy's immigrant past, however, has really sort of been kind of subsumed underneath this broader Caribbean identity. However, I guess the Costa Rican and the Panamanian aspects of it, I think, is what has kind of really been ignored in that process. But what does it say? I think it says a lot about the time period, really, in which Dolphy's family came to the United States, right? And that was one of the points that I was trying to address. You know, immigrants coming into the United States from the Caribbean, particularly in the earlier part of the 20th century, and the fact that at least Dolphy Sr. coming through New Orleans, they're immediately racialized in a very particular way, right? And I think Blackness in general really wasn't complicated or by immigration officials, by the society at large, with sort of the laws that were on the books about who was Black and who wasn't, right? And so Dolphy Sr. comes in, in the 1920s in New Orleans, and he's just a Negro, right, who happens to be from the Canal Zone. And so we don't really interrogate the diversity, I think, that's within the Black experience the way we do other populations. We could make the same argument for migrant Black populations from the South going into the North and to the West, right? There are regional cultures and regional differences that exist amongst Black people. Now, I don't want to get, I don't think we need to read into that too much, but, I guess just to limit everything to just Black, right, is really the problem. And there's so much more to it. And as we sort of peel back and think about the layer and look into the layers of Dolphy, we see all of these different influences coming from all over the place. But just to label him as Black from Los Angeles, just to label him as Black, with Caribbean roots, I think does us a disservice.
And I would certainly add, to think about his family who moved to New Orleans. I mean, that, as we know, the sort of racial landscape in New Orleans is vast. The Black racial landscape is vast in New Orleans. And so you're absolutely right. It's important to sort of tease that out. But I think also important to sort of tease out, how his family was situated there, right? So to be labeled Negro in New Orleans says something different than being labeled Negro in Chicago in the 1930s, right? And so yeah, I think there's a lot. I don't know if there's more to say there, or if that does it.
I think that does it.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Question for Professor Showers from the audience. You noted that some of the people you study came to the US as refugees. How did their experience as refugees shape their participation in or perspectives on Black freedom struggles?
That's a really good question, and thank you for posing it. And it's giving me actually some more food for thought. And I think that just in sort of response to this, there's a temporal context here. When I spoke and conducted these interviews, the people were sort of talking more specifically or locating themselves more specifically within the homeland politics, right? So they were really just talking about the dynamics of, say, Anglophone Cameroon versus French speaking, or Liberians were and Sierra Leoneans were much more engaged with what was happening at home and the stories and their trajectories into coming into the US. And so I think that, and this was obviously before I conducted these interviews, before Black Lives Matter. So I would actually be interested to see, given where we are now, right, how they will think about the sort of collective Black struggle today. But at the time, that just wasn't a sort of salient part of the things that came up.
Thank you. Thank you. This question is from the audience as well, for the entire panel. Yesterday, the keynote speaker, Cara Bush Davies, described the quote-unquote dual lives of migrants. Is this how you would describe the experiences of migrants? Were they living with one foot in their homeland and one in their new homes? Or is there another way to conceptualize this experience? Were they creating a new conceptualization of identity? Let's start with Professor Corinealdi, please.
That's a great question. And from what I encountered in terms of the research that I conducted, and then sort of being in the community myself, sort of like being a Brooklynite and thinking through what that experience has been like, I would say that it's more along the lines of a new conceptualization of identity. New because it really, in looking at how Afro-Panamanians have made home in Brooklyn, it's not just about being able to connect and keep in contact between Panama and the United States. It's really this idea of creating this broad Black diaspora that connects people from various parts of the Caribbean, that connects people to sort of freedom struggles in the African continent, right? During the 60s period, they're talking about that. They're talking about the US. And so this ability to really look at multiple spaces and think about the united struggles that Black people are facing really allows for a purposeful view of themselves as sort of world builders and world makers. And that's sort of why that framing for me is so important, and that it is local, right? They're local histories that are informing the activism and what they're bringing to the table. But there is a recognition that the struggles that are faced by Black people is something that can be the force of global conversations and global connections. That and what's possible in sort of creating and uniting as a group in a space like Brooklyn and beyond.
Professor Showers?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and I sort of would agree and piggyback of those themes, and I will add that, yeah, I will complicate sort of the notion of dual, right, or disjuncture here. I'm here and I'm there, right, and that's sort of two bipolar ways of thinking now. I think that there's more of a sort of global or multi-scalar location, and this is what I mean by that. By the people I interacted with, they were very much involved in their communities, in their local communities in the United States, in their immigrant communities. in terms of attending events, right, and being active. I met someone who was a nurse, but was also the head of the political opposition party, the US chapter, right? So there were ways in which they were enacting the local and the global within local space in DC in very interesting ways. But I also noted where they were connected back home in terms of the back and forth, right? So traveling back home. But there were also evidence of a sort of global identity. And a number of the people I met were very involved in their churches, and some were involved in sort of activism, going on mission trips to other countries besides the countries that they were from, so like to Kenya, for example. And then I will also think that there's a sort of generational issue too here between, say, the first generation and second generation African immigrants. The second generation Sierra Leoneans and Ghanaians who are actually moving or returning to Sierra Leone and making lives for themselves. So in ways that surprise their immigrant parents, you know, because their parents are saying, you know, why do you want to go back, you know? So I think there's sort of a back and forth that goes beyond a sort of duality or dual frame of reference. It's global, it's multi-scalar, and it involves sort of various interactions, homeland, the community, diaspora, new forms of diaspora.
Professor Chambers?
I think just sort of basically to continue one of the points that I made the last time. I don't think I think it matters what period we're talking about. You know, as a historian, your time period is everything, right? And so, you know, the fact that Dolphy's family went to Los Angeles when they did, right, in the late 1920s, when there's not a large Caribbean community there, there's not a large Panamanian or other Central American community there. And so the idea of having one foot in one culture and one foot in the other doesn't really come into play from what I've seen. You have, you know, this family is living in an African American community. They're very engaged in all aspects of the African American community. They are African Americans, right, in all of the ways that we think about it. When I say African American, I'm talking about really sort of assimilating into African American US based Southern type of culture, right? And so the Panamanian aspect or the Caribbean aspect doesn't come out in the same way, I think, if we're talking about later populations of immigrants, right? Had the Dolphin family come into Los Angeles in the 1970s or 1980s, we'd be having a very different conversation, I think. But because of when they came and where they settled, that experience, it's quite different.
And I think certainly through thinking about Davies' presentation and the first two sessions, our panelists and our keynote speaker have repeatedly said that time matters. And we certainly know that period matters. You all have made that point quite clear. But also how we think about location and home, and moving beyond place to think about location. So to take Professor Shower's point, how might we think about how might we rethink or transcend the dual and people's dual lives, or what does it mean to leave? Sometimes people leave but haven't actually left. They've just moved. And so I think those things are important for us to keep in mind. So another question from the audience. This is for Professor Chambers, from JH from the chat. How did civil rights factor into the music scene in which the music? Sorry, let me just insert a few things here. How did civil rights factor into the music scene that Dolphy took part in?
That's a great question. I think I'll start by saying, Dolphy's career span is from roughly 1958, when he first arrives on the scene with Chico Hamilton, until 1964, when he passes away in Europe of a diabetic coma. And so he's really, most of his activity is within this 6-year period. He's, playing on a lot of the music that Mingus did during the period, which, if we know anything about Charles Mingus, really started to push and have, messages within his music, mostly through titles and things of that nature, liner notes, where he sort of speaks to some of the events that are happening during the period. But in terms of Dolphy and civil rights, I think the biggest takeaway from Dolphy is really through the music, and really, I would argue, the musical children of Dolphy. When we talk about, say, the free jazz period that starts to develop around this time and pushes, into the late 60s, into the 1970s, Dolphy is seen by many as a major influence, right? And so that ability to play freely, to embrace all different aspects of world musics, global musics, really encompass all aspects of the diaspora, really push musical boundaries and conventions. We see that really play out in the later movement, so to speak, musically. I mentioned briefly in the paper someone like Coltrane. Dolphy and Coltrane were practice partners for a number of years, pushing each other to explore and push the music and incorporate all of these other influences. And so it's not, it's not civil rights sort of in this legal sense, or we're pushing this message and we're, being activists in the way that we traditionally think about it. But it really is sort of a protest through music, right? Protesting the conventions, which we know from the conventions that at least the way jazz musicians were judged by critics and others were very much rooted in sort of Western conceptions of music.
If I may ask that question differently, did Dolphy participate in any benefit concerts that civil rights organizations put on to raise money? And that would have been one way, if he did, I'm not sure. He might have participated in civil rights activism, as many jazz artists did, particularly through benefit concerts. So are you aware if he participated in any of those concerts?
Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of in that sense. You have to remember, Dolphy is also really a musician's musician. He's not someone who was headlining a lot of things. Actually, Dolphy had a hard time getting gigs on a consistent basis, which is in part what made him move to Europe to begin with, because there were more opportunities to work. He had a hard time working consistently in the US. And, when he did, most times he was relegated to working as a sideman.
Cool.
But I'm not familiar with him headlining anything or just sort of being prominently featured in any type of benefits or anything of that nature.
Thank you. This next question from the audience is for Professor Corinealdi. Could you tell us a bit more about the goals of women's organizing? Were they focused on helping migrants in the US or supporting communities in Panama?
Thank you for that question. So from the first 10 to 15 years of the organization, the focus is really on Black Panamanians who are migrating from Panama. So they're looking to support young people who are finishing up high school and beyond in the United States and are seeking to attend college. That expands significantly by the 70s. A good portion of those who are receiving the scholarship monies are African-American, largely African-American women, who sort of go on to study in places like George Washington University and Howard. And so there's this focus on really helping Black youth more broadly. So it begins with a deep interest in helping young Afro-Panamanians to get access to college because many had not had that opportunity in Panama. And it then expands because there's a recognition that in the United States, there's also been a lot of challenges that sort of African Americans and really anyone who's identifying and is identified as Black is experiencing. There is some work that the organization does in Panama as well, and that there is a branch of the organization that opens in Panama and has that opportunity to actually give money to students within Panama that want to study at the university, that want to study in the United States. And that becomes truly important because access to education, if you're not moneyed, if you don't have a particular, palanca or someone who will let you in, becomes really difficult. So in that way, the sort of organization really begins to expand even further to think about how those back in Panama, the place that they called home, can also benefit from the work that they did in the United States.
Okay, so this, one second. Okay, so this is going to be the last question. It's going to be the last question. And this is the question question from the audience for the entire panel. Can you speak a bit more about how migrants navigated in multi-ethnic communities in the U.S.? Would you describe these relationships as contentious or collaborative? Let's start with Professor Showers.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very, very interesting question. And I will say both. I've tended to think of these relationships as sort of full of solidarity, instances of solidarity, as well as disjuncture. So again, within the context of healthcare institutions, my research participants, there were moments where they felt that they had a lot in common, in the sort of commonality of experience with the diverse workforce. The healthcare recruits a largely international workforce. So many Africans sort of identified as immigrants they identified with other immigrant groups based on their status as immigrants. They also, there were instances where they felt solidarities along racial lines. Actually, a lot of the women sort of understood their identities in really intersectional ways. So they talked about being Black, being foreign, being an immigrant, being a woman, right? And they could sort of identify with other women of color. There were instances of disjuncture where they believed, again, as I sort of talked about what I'm thinking as African origin discrimination, where African immigrants believed that they were at the bottom of racial hierarchies. So they thought that US-born Blacks sort of had an advantage. Can you hear me? I'm sorry. I thought my sound was going off. So yeah. So I think both. So in response to the question, relationships of contention. So that I think of as solidarity, but also moments of disjuncture and conflict.
Let's go to Professor Chambers next.
I didn't really, in my work, encounter, I guess, my population, whether it's the Dolphy work or it's the work I've done extensively in New Orleans. in which Black immigrants in particular encountered multi-ethnic populations in the ways that I think the question is sort of getting at. It's mostly been sort of confronting the Black-white dynamic, the racial dynamic, first in the US South, right, in a place like New Orleans, and confronting Jim Crow as Black people within Black spaces, right? Living within Black communities, being involved in Black churches, working in industries where other Blacks were the majority of workers. And so their life was really segregated in that way along racial lines. And then when we get out, say, to California, in the Dolphy example, some of which I've mentioned previously, again, you're living in spaces with other Black people. Now, I don't know whether if that was by choice or not, but we know the history of redlining and all these other things in which people were limited in terms of the spaces in which they could go. And so if there's any multi-ethnic, interacting, with others outside of the Black community, it's usually not done on equal terms. And they are forced to, again, confront the realities that all other Black people were facing in those spaces.
Appreciate that, Professor Corinealdi.
To that, I would add that for the period that I looked at from the 60s and certainly to the present moment, what I did see in spaces like New York was the leadership that Afro-Panamanians took on when it came to creating Latino studies programs in New York, when it came to actually creating urban study centers. And so doing this work involved looking at a multi-ethnic Black diaspora. They really engaged with people from Haiti, from Puerto Rico, from the Dominican Republic, from other areas to really think about what would be necessary for that next generation that were going to be students, right? The very generation that Las Cervidoras was raising scholarship monies for, they were really interacting with each other in this way. And I think that leads to this idea of the complexity of Blackness, right? They all understood that they were bringing really rich ethnic and cultural backdrops to their unique experiences in New York, and that they could help in that regard. And so in thinking about how you have Afro-Panamanians helping in coordinating the West India Day Parade, and also helping to create a Black Solidarity Day, and also helping to run some of the English and Spanish language radio stations in New York, you see the ability for Afro-Panamanians to really be a kind of bridge builders between multiple ethnic and cultural groups that call Brooklyn home.
I gotta say, this has been really fantastic. I would love to spend another couple of hours, but I know that we unfortunately do not have that time. I want to thank my esteemed panelists for engaging us, and again, what I think has been a really great conversation. I think we have certainly seen, if you had a chance to attend one or two of the previous sessions, there's some wonderful continuities, and I think it's just, again, gives us much to engage and to discuss. Thank all the folks who are in the audience who have attended today's session. Again, we certainly appreciate you and appreciate your work and appreciate your really, really wonderful questions. I know certainly I think I can speak for the panelists to say that's certainly engaged them considerably. And so please mark your calendars because sessions continue. We will continue the symposium next Friday, March 12th. Next Friday, March 12th. Put it in your iPhone, your iPad, your something, just remember. And so we will continue Friday, March 12th with session 4, titled Artistic Encounters, Literature, Music, and Art History. I want to remind you that we have 7 more sessions over the next 3 weeks. So please check the full symposium schedule for more information. and the registration link. Please, everyone, have a wonderful evening and weekend. Be safe, be careful, take care of yourselves and others. We thank you, and hopefully we'll see you next week.